So up to this point, we've learned a few different things, namely that we should be building our mask around our base exposure, that we can match the brightness values of our exposures to some degree to come out with a really natural blend, and that we can pre-mask in order to create a much better selection of the areas that we want to mask. Now I'm going to show you something a little bit different. Not all of our exposures are going to work in a really simple way. Sometimes we have to be a little bit more creative. For example, in this scene we have a good base exposure. We have some underexposed areas in the rocks, and we have some overexposed areas in the sky. We have a brighter exposure which has information in the rocks here, and we have a darker exposure which has plenty of information in the sky. Now, I want to blend the darker exposure into the base exposure, but we can see from this base exposure that we're probably not going to make a good selection of the sky. I mean, even if I bring up the highlights and the white point and the exposure, we're still going to have much of this part of the sky visible in our mask. So in the past I said we should build our mask around the base exposure, but I also said we should build our mask around the exposure that's going to give us the best selection. Now if we go over to our brighter exposure, look at how bright that sky is. If we bring up our highlights significantly and the white point significantly, and then bring down our shadows and possibly even bring up our exposure, we now have a much brighter sky. Now it doesn't actually have to be that bright, so I'm going to bring the exposure down a little bit more and possibly bring the shadows up a little bit. So essentially we're building our mask, we're pre-masking on the brighter exposure because that'll give us the best selection of the sky. Now you might be wondering why I don't just use this brighter exposure as the base exposure in the first place. Well, that's because I like this exposure. This is my best exposure. It's got all the information that I really need, apart from some overexposed and underexposed areas, but I really like the line of the water going along here too. So I want to keep this exposure as my base exposure. Now, in reality, with this scene, I don't even need a brighter exposure. I could probably just bring up the shadows a little bit and that would do a good enough job. But that wouldn't really teach you any new techniques, because undoubtedly in the future you are going to come across a scene where you need to build your masks around a brighter exposure. But you'll remember me saying we've got to build a mask around the base exposure, so that might confuse you and make you go down the wrong direction. So I'm using these purely as an example of how you can be more flexible in how you create your masks and on which exposures you pre-mask. So we've got our base exposure here, we've got our brighter exposure and our darker exposure. And I'm going to go to lens corrections and I'm going to check the usual boxes. Now I'm going to go to the darker exposure and I'm going to match. So if I bring up the exposure quite a bit, bring the highlights down significantly, and bring the shadows up a tiny bit too. We don't need to do this too much. Maybe that's a bit much there. So now we've got a great sky and the exposure isn't too dark. It should fit nicely onto our base exposure. And now we've pre-masked our brighter exposure. We can select all three, hold down Shift and choose Open Objects. Then of course we can stack our images. Now, as always, I'm putting my base exposure at the bottom, my brighter exposure on top, and my darker exposure in the middle. First thing I want to do is blend the darker exposure into the base exposure. So what I'm going to do here is make the brighter exposure visible. Remember that this is the exposure that we pre-masked on. So I'm going to open Instamask and choose Bright Swan, let's say. And there you go, that's already given us a good selection of the sky and some of the water. And we can manually mask out the water if we don't want that to be selected. But for now, I'm just going to press Select, choose the darker exposure, create a black mask, hide the marching ants, show that layer, choose a white brush, and make the brighter exposure invisible. Now I'm going to make my brush larger, make sure I've got 100% opacity for the brush, and we're just going to paint in that darker exposure in the sky. And now we just need to do a little bit of the water here, just on the horizon, and because we've matched, you see, it looks almost seamless. If someone just looked at that image right now, they could never tell that this area here in the water belongs to two separate exposures. But we can actually match the base exposure. If you remember, we can bring down the highlights. just to darken the water a little bit, just to make that transition a little bit smoother. So there you go. It's the same brightness here from the darker exposure as the base exposure here. So now we have a smooth blend. And usually this is quite difficult because you see the horizon, the water here, is in a very different spot on the base exposure to the darker exposure. But we used all of the dark exposure for that water there, and the matching allowed us to create a seamless blend between the darker and brighter exposures. Now that I've finished, I can press deselect, and I can go to my brighter exposure. Now, we don't want to keep it the way it is because obviously it looks a little bit crazy, so we can open up Adobe Camera Raw and press default. So now we've got our default rocks back and everything's set to how it was previously. We can just press OK. Now we want to make a selection of the shadows here. We want to bring through the rock from the bright exposure on top and put that in to this image here just to brighten up the rocks. Now we can't build that mask on the base exposure because watch what happens if, let's say, I go for a darks 2. You see we're including the sky in the mask as well. So just as before, we're going to build the mask around the brighter exposure because that clearly separates the boulders from the sky. Watch what happens if I press darks 2. We now have a good selection of the boulders and only a tiny selection of the sky. Let's go to the RGB masks and see if we can get a better selection. So I want a selection of the rocks. I want the rocks to be white and less of the sky and maybe less of the water. But the water is not a big deal. So let's go to darks 2 on the blue channel. Well, that gives us a great selection without the sky. What about darks 2 on the red channel? And that gives us an even better selection. So you see we almost have no sky here and we've got a good selection of the rocks. And the green channel, not so much. We have some of the sky here. So let's go for darks 2. What about darks 1? No, that involves too much of the sky. So I'm going to close this and make a selection. So I press select, choose a black mask on the bright exposure, a white brush, hide the marching ants, and now I've got my opacity at 100%, and that should be fine for the top part of the rock here. See, we're just blending that in just once. We don't need to go over it again, and I'm going to press deselect. Now one of the problems is, you see we've softened part of the rock here. If you look, it's very soft down the bottom along this area here. And that's because that's where the water extends to on this exposure. You see, it's naturally soft. So I'm going to choose a black brush, select the mask of that layer, choose an opacity of, let's say, 10%. And I'm going to mask out that area in the rock so it doesn't look so soft. In fact, let's go to 30% and make it a bit stronger. So now, that's before and after. You see, we've still brightened up the rocks beautifully, and it looks correct. We don't have any patchy areas which are too bright. Now, these rocks are a little bit too bright. We don't want them to be that bright, so we can bring down the opacity of the brighter exposure, and there's the before and after. We've got some gorgeous textures and details in there. Now, I want to show you some cool techniques that we've got in Raya Pro. But before I do that, I just want to deselect any active selection we might have. And I want to create a new layer because you might notice that we've got some sensor dirt on here. It could be water because I was getting splashed quite significantly when I was doing this. But to get rid of that, we can click on the clone stamp here. Make sure we've got all layers selected. And I'm going to clone, make a smallish brush. I'm going to clone about here. So I hold down Alt or Option on a Mac, and then I drag the cloned area on top of there. And that's it. And now here I'm going to clone about there and do the same here. And you can do the same to any other areas that might have a little bit of sensor dirt on them. So when that's done, I press Command and 0 or Control and 0 and go to full size. And there are a couple of other spots there, but I'm going to leave that as it is. Now, if we want, we can darken the sky a little bit. I don't think we need to here, but let's have a little experiment. I'm going to create a curves layer and clip it to the darker exposure. And I'm just bringing down some of the sky. Actually, that looks okay. Adds a bit more color and a bit more contrast. Now, if you think that the shadows are too dark, and they're not here, but if you think that they are, we can open up the Dodge and Burn panel and we can go to something called Protect Shadows. And that will literally target our shadows and brighten them up. So the darkest tones in our image. And it creates kind of a soft, contrasty feel. Now I'm going to delete that anyway, because I don't think we need it here. I think this is probably the right amount of brightness throughout the image. You see the histogram stretches all the way along. We've got some tiny clipped areas, probably around here, and some nice bright highlights. So that's a good balance. Now if we want, something I like to do is to bring down the midtones quite significantly. In fact, I'm going to do this with a levels layer. Open a levels layer, I bring down the midtones to darken the image, and then bring up the shadows. And that creates a kind of intimate feel in your photo. And when you're done, you can bring down the opacity. So here's a before and after. We're just softening that contrast a tiny bit, but at the same time, darkening the image. Before and after. Now I'm going to bring the opacity down a little bit there. We don't want it to be too strong, and we don't want these rocks to be too dark either. Now I'm going to create an Orton effect, which is something that I really enjoy. It adds a soft, glowing feel to our image, and we can do that through dodge and burn again. And all we can do is go to Orton effect or Orton effect bright. So if you want a brighter Orton effect, we can click on that. And then I'm going to choose a radius of about 43. The larger your image, the larger the radius. So I'm using Nikon D800 files, which are very large. So I can use a larger radius, and see that creates a soft glow. But it also brightens up the image. If you use the normal Orton effect, that will give us the same kind of glow, and we can control how much of the image we actually brighten up, if at all. And then when you press OK, you can bring down the opacity of that. I usually go for a really soft Orton effect. So that's probably enough. Now I actually think that this image could be a little bit dark. So if I just choose my levels layer, I can bring the highlight slider along. And you'll notice that we're probably going to overexpose the horizon here where the sun is. So I can open up Instamask, create a bright mask, and I can target just those areas and mask them out. So that's what I'm doing now. And then I can press select, and you see we're going to choose a black brush with the mask selected, hide the marching ants, with an opacity of 100%. And look, I just paint out those overexposed areas. So now we've brightened up the image without overexposing it. I'm going to press Command and D or Control and D or deselect to deselect the active selection, and I'm going to paint out some of the areas here in the foreground. Now I want to dodge and burn here, and I've already shown you one way to dodge and burn. So I basically want to brighten up this water along here. Before I do that, why don't we give ourselves a little bit more detail in here? Now remember, the water comes from our base exposure. So if I double click on the thumbnail here or press Adobe Camera Raw, I can open up ACR just like we've done before, and I can add local contrast. You see we're adding contrast to the water in the foreground, and I can press OK there. Now if you find that that's added too much local contrast to the rocks, you can undo it and right click, New Smart Object via Copy. Then you can open up Adobe Camera Raw again and add clarity again. Press OK. Create a black mask on this layer, so I can press black M, a white brush, and look, we can just paint in the water from that area. Now that's a little bit more accurate than if we open up Adobe Camera Raw and going to the brush that we have up here. And there we can paint in specific changes, but it doesn't quite give us as much control as using a mask on this exposure does. And this is still a non-destructive process. Now, as it is, I actually quite like the textures on those rocks. So I'm going to paint in some of those textures. Makes me feel like I can almost touch the sides of these rocks and feel the different textures on them. And of course, we can bring down that opacity if we want. And now to finish, we can change the dynamic of light in the scene. We can push the viewer towards this bright horizon and create kind of a dynamic vignette. And I do that by opening up a curves layer, bringing down the midtones, bringing up the shadows a little bit. And then I can press Command and I to invert that mask, create a larger brush with a foreground at white. Now watch what happens. I can paint along here, and a larger brush, paint along the outside of this rock a little bit. And by doing that, we're taking the viewer's eye away from this side of the rock and pushing them also to the highlighted sides of the rocks. So that's before and after. Now, one thing I don't want to do is to darken any part of that sky in the horizon. So I can undo some of the masking I did there, press Command and J, and you see we strengthen the effect, Command and I, which inverts the mask on the duplicated layer. I open up that curves layer and I just create some more brightness. Now we don't really want the brightness on the rocks there, so I'm going to mask that out quite freely. It doesn't matter if it's not particularly clean. In any other areas that we don't want included in the mask, we can paint them out like that. And now we've concentrated the brightness just on the horizon. Now I create a really big brush at around 50% opacity, and I can slowly brush in brightness along there. So we've created a softer transition going from the bright horizon to the sides of these rocks. Now if I select these two curves layers and press Command and G or Control and G to group them, that's the original image, which is really open. So we've got brightness throughout the whole image, but we want to direct the viewer's eyes to the brightest parts of the image and then to these gorgeous reflection parts on the rocks. So this is after. And you see, we've done that beautifully. We've softened all the details throughout the image and concentrated our viewer's eyes to the right areas. Of course, if that's too dark or too strong, we can bring down the opacity of that layer. Now, one last thing, I told you I was going to show you how to dodge and burn, but I'm going to do it destructively because I've already shown you how to use the Highlights, Midtone, Shadows button. So this time, we're going to use the Merge button, and this merges all of our layers. Now, to use this button, you must make sure that the layer that you had selected previously was visible. We can't create a merge layer on an invisible layer, so it has to be visible. Then we can press Dodge, Burn, or the Sponge tool. I'm going to go for Dodge, and I'm going to select that layer that we just created. And I'm going to choose the midtones with an exposure, let's say of about 20, and just paint along this water here. We don't want it to be too crazy or too strong, so I can bring down the opacity. And now if we feel like it's becoming oversaturated, a lot of people use the sponge button here to reduce the color that they've added to this scene. But instead of doing that, we can go to the blend mode and go down to luminosity and just watch the water in the foreground here. Luminosity. You see, we still kept the brightness levels, but we're not affecting the color of the water. So that's before and after. And if that is a little bit strong compared to the rest of the image, we can bring down the opacity until it looks much more fitting. So there you go. And if you want, you can also dodge the sides of the rocks if you want to brighten them up a tiny bit. So there you go, there's the before and after. So that is our final image. Let me show you what it looked like when we first started. So we have overexposed highlights, underexposed shadows, we've got some dirt in the sky, we've still got a little bit in some areas. And there's no real direction for our viewers to look in, but when we're finished, the final image not only brings back the gorgeous information in the sky and in the foreground, it merges all of these exposures very naturally, it brings detail back into these rocks, and it creates a gorgeous scene for the viewer to be pulled in towards a strong light source where the sun's setting, and then to these gorgeous textures on the sides of the rocks. So I hope you've enjoyed this workflow. And of course, the main teaching point of this tutorial was to show you that we can build masks around exposures that aren't necessarily our base exposure. So I used the brightest exposure here. So we can be more creative, we just have to ask ourselves which exposure is going to give us the best mask.